On September 3, 1968, 10 gang members were found charred beyond recognition inside an abandoned cattle barn on the outskirts of Redford County, Texas. The fire was so intense that the metal support beams bent inward, and the sheriff's department could only recover fragments of weapons, melted belt buckles, and the scorched outline of a card table. It was not an accident. It was not a warning. It was a verdict. Behind the brutality stood a single bloodline feared across the desert plains. The Redford clan, 7 men bound by one rule: no debt goes unpaid. For decades, the Redfords had operated underground gambling rings across truck stops, dive bars, and backroom dens. Their reputation was carved through violence, silence, and an unyielding sense of retribution. They handled disputes their own way, quietly, ruthlessly, and without hesitation. But everything changed when a crew of out-of-town gang members decided they could rig a high-stakes game, cheat the Redfords, and walk away with thousands of dollars in cash. They thought the Redfords were relics, old Texas cowboys with outdated methods and fading influence. They were wrong. What followed that night would become one of the most horrifying acts of retaliation in Texas history, a calculated inferno that transformed a cattle barn into a furnace and erased an entire gang in less than 30 minutes. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, drop your like, and comment the city and exact time you're watching this. It helps this investigation reach more people. The heat in Redford County that September felt heavier than usual, the kind of heat that clung to a man's skin and made tempers shorter than they already were. The desert wind blew dry and restless across the plains, carrying dust, cigarette ash, and the faint smell of gasoline from the old Redford truck yard. It was a Monday afternoon when the debt first turned into a threat, one the Redford clan would not ignore. Inside the dim back room of Dalton's Roadhouse, a battered wooden table sat beneath a flickering light bulb. The table had hosted thousands of dollars in bets, at least 4 fistfights, and 1 shooting over the last 15 years. But that night, it hosted something far worse: humiliation. For the Redford clan, humiliation was the same as violence, and violence demanded an answer. Harlan Redford, the eldest of the 7 brothers, leaned forward with both hands on the table, his jaw tightened beneath a graying beard. At 45, Harlan carried the weight of the clan on his shoulders. He was the strategist, the mind behind every profitable gamble, every retaliation, and every whisper of fear that passed through the desert towns. When he spoke, men listened. $26,000, Harlan said slowly. That's what they walked out with, money that belonged to us. Beside him stood the remaining 6 brothers: Wade, the second oldest and the clan's enforcer; the twins, Roy and Ray, known as Double Trouble across the county; Jesse, the quiet sharpshooter; Caleb, the youngest with a mean streak; and Alan, the one who kept track of every book, bet, and debt the clan handled. Together they formed a force that law enforcement hated, locals feared, and rivals avoided at all costs. Wade crossed his arms, his biceps stretching the worn fabric of his plaid shirt. "They didn't just take the money," he growled. "They spit in our damn faces, cheated a Redford table. That's a death wish." Alan opened his ledger, flipping through pages filled with debts, dates, names, and coded notes. "Those boys from El Paso," he murmured. "They weren't supposed to be anything special. Just another street crew looking to gamble. But they didn't just cheat. They brought loaded dice, false shuffling techniques, and a distraction layout. It was planned." Harlan's eyes narrowed. "Who led them?" "Guy by the name of Victor Trujillo," Alan replied. "Goes by Vic. Thinks he's some kind of outlaw philosopher. The others follow him like dogs following a stake." Wade spat on the floorboards. "Then we'll cut the head off the dog." Caleb, the youngest at 26, cracked his knuckles with a grin. "Or burn the whole damn kennel." Silence settled over the room. Not fearful silence, but the heavy, knowing quiet of men already picturing what needed to be done. The Redfords didn't call the sheriff. They didn't negotiate. They didn't ask for explanations. A debt that large wasn't money. It was respect. And respect was the foundation their entire family power rested on. If someone got away with cheating them, Then every gambler from Louisiana to New Mexico would try the same. Wade leaned closer to Harlan. You know what Pa used to say. Harlan nodded, finishing the phrase. A debt unpaid is a fire waiting to happen. The fire was already beginning to spark. Roy and Ray stepped forward, their identical voices practically overlapping. We've been watching Vic's boys, Ray said. They're hiding out at an old cattle barn off Route 19. Heard they're planning to skip Texas by tomorrow night. They won't make it out of Redford County, Roy added. We'll see to that. Jesse, silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who rarely talked because he rarely needed to. We need to corner them. Lock the exits. Make sure none of them slip out. If we're doing this, he said, leveling his gaze at the others, we're doing it clean. Caleb smirked. Clean ain't exactly how this is gonna go. No, Harlan agreed. It's not. He walked toward the door, pushed it open, and the late afternoon sunlight spilled into the room, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The brothers followed, boots crunching over gravel as they crossed the yard toward their trucks. The desert stretched endless before them. Dry earth, scattered shrubs, rusted barbed wire fences. A lawless canvas where a family like theirs had flourished. Harlan paused by his truck, running a hand across the side. We don't do this out of anger, he said, looking at each brother in turn. We do it because the Redford name means something. If they steal from us, they burn. Simple as that. Wade nodded first, then the twins, then Jesse, Alan, and Caleb, 7 men. One decision, a decision that would end 10 lives. As the engines roared to life, dust rising beneath spinning tires, the Redford clan rolled out like a convoy of vengeance heading toward the abandoned barn. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. They'd grown up with the same lessons, the same punishments, the same code carved into their bones. Debts weren't forgiven, disrespect wasn't ignored, and betrayal was handled with fire. The sun dipped low as the truck sped down the dirt road, leaving a trail of dust swirling in the fading light. Ahead, the cattle barn waited, old, isolated, forgotten. Before morning came, it would burn hotter than any Texas dawn, and inside it, 10 men who thought they could cheat the Redfords would learn the final rule of the clan. No one steals from a family that has nothing left to lose. The sun had barely lifted above the Texas horizon when the Redford brothers began to move. Heat rose early in the panhandle, clinging to the air with a heavy dryness that made every breath taste of dust. The small wooden cabin they shared, weathered, cracked, and surrounded by fields that never quite grew right, sat quiet, but inside it, tension simmered. The clan had always been a tight unit, 7 men raised under the same brutal code, carved by a father who believed pain was a teacher and violence was a language. By 1968, that language had become the only one they spoke fluently. Daniel Redford, the eldest, the one with the scar that cut across his cheek like a lightning strike, stood at the iron sink scrubbing soot off his hands. He was the type of man who rarely spoke unless necessary, but when he did, decisions followed. Behind him, Cole and Mason were loading ammunition into thick leather satchels, each movement done with a cold, practiced calm. The younger twins, Wyatt and Henry, cleaned rifles at the kitchen table, their faces still carrying traces of boyhood but their eyes already hardened by the life they had inherited. The remaining 2, Rylan and Seth, worked outside getting the truck ready, tossing jugs of gasoline into the back with the same ease other men tossed sacks of grain. Everything the Redfords were doing that morning had one purpose: sending a message. The gambling debt wasn't just about money. People in town whispered that the Redfords didn't care about the numbers. They cared about respect. 10 gang members from Amarillo had arrived 3 weeks earlier, calling themselves the Rattlers, a name painted in green across their leather jackets. They rolled in loud, barging into local bars, extending credit to locals in backroom games, and pretending they owned a piece of the county. They had laughed at Daniel when he gave them the only warning he ever gave: "Pay what you owe or leave this land." The leader, a man named Felix Harlow, spat tobacco on Daniel's boot and laughed. That moment was the real debt, and now the Redfords intended to collect it. Daniel turned away from the sink, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked over his brothers. The cabin smelled of gun oil, dust, and brewing coffee. Texas staples that meant the day was beginning. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "We do this clean. We do this fast," he said. "No one runs today." Cole glanced up from the bullets he was slotting neatly into a wooden box. "We hitting the camp first?" he asked. Daniel nodded. The Rattlers had set up behind an abandoned grain mill on the outskirts of town. They thought being near old tracks and broken silos made them invisible, but nothing in Redford County stayed hidden for long, not from the clan. The truck engine roared to life outside. Dust swirled around the tires as Seth revved it twice, a habit he'd had since he learned to drive at 13. Daniel stepped outside, the screen door creaking behind him, and the heat slapped him in the face like a physical force. He surveyed the land he'd been walking since he was a boy. Dry fields, splintered fences, a land that punished weakness, a land that belonged to them. The brothers piled in, boots thumping on metal. Daniel rode shotgun. As Seth took the wheel and the truck lurched forward, the Redfords didn't look back at the cabin. They didn't need to. Their minds were fixed on what counted: the debt, the disrespect, the fire that was coming. The dirt road leading out of their property was long and narrow. Tumbleweeds rolled across it like ghosts. Coyotes lingered in the distance, pacing the hills, their silhouettes thin and watchful. Ryland smoked a cigarette in the back, blowing the smoke out the window as the truck bounced over potholes. Mason checked his shotgun again, then again. Anxiety was not something the Redfords showed, but readiness, true readiness, required ritual. "What do we do if they're armed?" Wyatt asked, breaking the silence. Daniel didn't turn his head. "Same thing we do if they're not." Wyatt nodded, understanding the rule. Fairness had no place in Texas retribution. By the time they neared the grain mill, the morning fog had thickened, hugging the earth in a pale gray sheet. The mill itself stood half-collapsed, its metal siding rusted orange, its windows smashed from storms long past. The Rattlers' makeshift camp stretched along the weeds and dirt. 10 bikes leaned in a row, garbage scattered, beer bottles glinting in the sun like broken mirrors. Daniel raised a hand, and Seth eased the truck to a stop behind a cluster of mesquite trees. The brothers jumped out, crouching as they moved. The air smelled of gasoline and rotten weeds. Crows perched along the rusted silo beams, cawing in harsh, discordant cries. "Positions," Daniel said quietly. It was the only word he needed. The brothers split. Mason and Cole flanked the right, slipping behind machinery. Wyatt and Henry circled left, moving like shadows. Ryland and Seth hung back to block any escape route. Daniel walked forward alone, boots crunching on gravel, not bothering with stealth. He wanted them to see him. And they did. Felix Harlow stepped out of a tent, half-dressed, tattoos wrapping his arms like vines. His men followed, some gripping bottles, others reaching for weapons. Felix grinned wide. "Well, well," he said, leaning forward with a mocking drawl. "If it ain't Daddy Redford's favorite son." Daniel didn't smile. "Debts due." Felix spat again, this time on the ground. "You think 7 farm boys can collect from 10 armed men?" Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Not 10. Felix frowned. "What's that supposed to?" Before he could finish, the morning exploded. A single rifle shot cracked through the fog. It came from the left. Henry's position. The bullet hit the ground inches from Felix's boot, a warning shot so precise it drew gasps from the Rattlers. Daniel didn't move. "That was your only chance to walk away," he said. Felix's face twisted into rage. "Get them." But the Rattlers didn't move forward, because now they could see them, the Redfords, emerging from the fog in 7 different angles, rifles raised, eyes locked, jaws tight. The brothers looked less like men and more like a verdict. For a split second, the grain mill went silent. Even the crows perched on the rusted beams seemed to lose their voices as the fog curled around the scene like a tightening fist. The Rattlers froze, 10 men caught between their instincts and the unmistakable sight of the Redford brothers encircling them. 7 rifles, 7 men, 7 cold expressions that carried more certainty than any badge or courtroom ever could. Felix Harlow was the first to move. He reached for the knife at his hip, not because he believed it would change anything, but because pride demanded that he show he wasn't afraid. But even that small gesture was enough to break the thin membrane of hesitation holding the gang together. "Spread out," Felix shouted. 4 rattlers bolted toward the far side of the mill. 2 scrambled toward their bikes. The rest crouched behind barrels and broken pallets, fumbling for weapons. Their sudden scramble shattered the fragile stillness, igniting the chain reaction the Redfords had come prepared for. Daniel didn't yell a command. He didn't need to. His brothers had been raised to read a moment the same way they read a horizon, instinctively, wordlessly. As Felix's men scattered, the Redfords adjusted their positions with the precision of men who had been rehearsing violence since childhood. Cole fired first, one clean shot that struck the ground inches from a rattler's hand as he reached for a pistol. A warning, not a kill. The Redfords never opened with fatalities. They opened with control. Mason followed, firing a round into a stack of wooden crates behind which 2 rattlers hid. Splinters erupted into the fog. The message was unmistakable. We decide where you stand. Rylan and Seth secured the rear, blocking the escape toward the dried creek bed. They held their rifles level but didn't shoot yet. Wyatt and Henry closed in on the left flank, their silhouettes merging with the fog, faces set in that blank expression the family shared. Neither anger nor adrenaline, just the steadiness of purpose. Felix crouched behind a rusted metal hopper, breathing hard, his rage fighting with something new. Realization. He had dismissed the Redfords as rural trash, as nothing but illiterate farmhands with tempers and shotguns. But the way they moved, the silence among them, the absolute lack of fear, Felix had miscalculated. Daniel stepped forward, out of the fog, boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't have to. "You took money that wasn't yours," Daniel said, voice steady and carrying across the clearing. "Then you mocked what should have scared you." Felix grinned through the fear. "You really think you can handle 10 armed men?" "Already doing it," Daniel replied. A shot rang out. Not from the Redfords this time, but from a nervous rattler hiding behind a broken tractor. The bullet whizzed past Henry's shoulder, hitting the side of the mill with a sharp clang. That was the moment the rules changed. Henry fired back immediately, not to kill, but to disarm. The bullet struck the rattler's gun, knocking it clean from his grip. The man screamed as his hand snapped back, more from shock than pain. Wyatt moved on him fast, sprinting through the fog as silent as a predator, and slammed him to the ground with the butt of his rifle. Dust exploded upward. The rattler wheezed. "You fire at us," Wyatt said, his voice cold. "You don't get another chance." Another rattler tried to break for the bikes, sprinting toward the row of chrome motorcycles lined up near the silos. He almost made it, until Mason stepped into his path, placing one boot on the ground with enough force to halt him. Mason didn't speak. He simply raised the rifle and shot the tire of the nearest bike. Air exploded out in a violent hiss. The man skidded to a stop, breathing hard. "You ain't leaving," Mason said softly. Meanwhile, Cole confronted 2 others who were trying to climb the broken stairs of the grain tower, hoping to use height as advantage. He aimed at the thin metal railing above them and fired. The entire staircase shook violently, the old iron rattling like bones. The men froze. One lost balance and dropped back to the ground, hitting the dirt with a thud. Seth and Rylan were now herding the remaining rattlers back toward the center like cattle being driven into a pen. Every move was tactical, structured, familiar. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. A dance the Redfords knew better than any man alive. Felix cursed under his breath as he watched his crew get boxed in with almost surgical efficiency. He wiped sweat from his forehead, smearing dirt across his skin. His bravado was crumbling. "What do you want?" Felix shouted. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "Payment." Felix spat on the ground again, but this time the gesture lacked conviction. Fine, I'll pay. Hell, we'll all pay. Daniel shook his head once. Not enough. You should know that by now. Felix's chest tightened. Then what? You want blood? That it? Daniel's eyes narrowed. Not with hatred, but with something colder. I want you to understand the fire you walked into. The fog shifted, and for the first time Felix saw what was in the back of the Redford truck. Jugs of gasoline lined neatly like tools in a workshop. Felix's face drained. You can't be serious, he stammered. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he lifted his hand. One small motion, subtle yet absolute. It was the signal. Wyatt and Henry moved at once, grabbing the first two rattlers by the arms and dragging them toward the center of the camp. Cole and Mason did the same on the right side. Seth and Ryland stepped forward, rifles raised to ensure no one tried running. The rattlers, now surrounded in a tight circle, were breathing hard, eyes wide. The fog clung to them like a shroud. Daniel took slow, deliberate steps toward the center, boots echoing in the dead silence. I gave you a warning. You chose disrespect. He nodded toward the gasoline in Seth's hands. Now you'll learn what happens when a Redford debt goes unpaid. The rattlers trembled, and the fire line began. The Redford brothers moved as one through the mesquite shadows, each step silent, deliberate, and soaked in the weight of what they were about to do. The night air carried the dry scent of dust and distant cattle, but beneath it lingered something sharper, anticipation, edged with rage. The abandoned barn where the Reyes circle slept stood ahead like a dark, sagging beast in the field. A single lantern flickered inside, barely visible through cracks in the warped wood. The gang had no guards posted, no lookout, no sense of danger. They believed the Redfords to be ranchers, men tied to the land, predictable and slow. They had no idea they had awakened something older, something forged in fire and bloodlines. Warren raised a hand, signaling the brothers to halt. They crouched behind a fallen log, studying the structure. Elias's breath was shallow. The bruising on his ribs still flared with every inhale, but the pain only sharpened his conviction. Boone carried the kerosene canister, its weight knocking against his leg with each movement. Micah wrapped the rope around his forearm. Caleb held the iron crowbar their father used to pry open barn doors during storms. Jareth, the quietest of them all, carried nothing but an axe and a stare that betrayed no emotion. Warren whispered, "We do this clean. No screaming, no wasted movement. In and out, and let the flames speak." The brothers nodded. They circled the barn like wolves, moving to their assigned posts. Inside, the Reyes circle laughed drunkenly, their voices echoing through the walls. Someone slammed a bottle against a crate. Someone else cursed loudly. Elias felt a tremor in his hands, not of fear but of clarity. This was not vengeance driven by rage. It was a settlement of an unpaid debt. Warren signaled. Boone unscrewed the kerosene cap and began pouring thin streams around the base of the walls, soaking the brittle wood until it glistened. Micah did the same on the opposite side, forming a perfect perimeter. Caleb and Jareth secured the doors with rope pulled tight between the handles and the support beams, fashioning crude but unbreakable locks. Not one of the gang members inside noticed. Their laughter continued, slurred and careless. Elias stepped forward, holding a matchbook between two fingers. His bruised knuckles appeared almost black in the moonlight. Warren placed a hand on his shoulder. Steady, grounding, brotherly. "You sure you want to be the one?" Warren asked quietly. Elias nodded. "They made this mine." Warren didn't argue. He stepped back. Elias struck the first match. The tiny flame was fragile, flickering against the gusts of wind sweeping across the field. For a moment it looked as though it might die, but Elias cupped his hand around it, shielding it, feeding it. When he dropped it into the kerosene trail, the fire spread instantly, a bright, angry line racing along the walls, devouring everything in its path. Inside, the laughter stopped. A sudden slam echoed. Then another. Confused voices rose into panic as the gang members realized the doors were sealed. The brothers heard shouts, frantic scrambling, the clattering of crates tipping over. The barn groaned as the fire climbed, its wooden beams cracking under the heat. Flames shot upward, swirling orange against the night sky. Warren motioned for the brothers to move back. Keep distance. Let the fire take them. The barn became a furnace within minutes. The Reyes circle hammered against the doors, but the rope held firm. Their silhouettes darted behind the cracks in the wood, distorted by the rising flames. Some screamed. Others cursed the Redford name. One yelled that they never meant to kill Elias, only scare him, but none of it mattered. The Redfords stood in a straight line 20 yards away, faces illuminated by the blaze. Boone tightened his jaw. They'd have killed us if they could. Micah nodded. They picked the wrong family. Caleb and Jareth watched in silence, the fire reflecting in their eyes like a ritual they had rehearsed all their lives. For the Redfords, violence was never impulsive. It was a language, and tonight they spoke it fluently. The roof collapsed. Sparks shot into the sky like dying stars. The screaming stopped one voice at a time. Soon there was only the roar of flames consuming what had been a makeshift fortress for the gang. Elias lowered his head. The heat washed over him, but it wasn't enough to match the heat he had carried since the night they beat him. Warren stepped beside him. "It's done," Warren said, voice steady. But Elias didn't answer, because deep inside him, past the bruises and past the rage, he felt something cold instead of relief. The knowledge that violence, once awakened, never returns quietly to sleep. And in burning 10 men alive, the Redfords had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. When the barn collapsed entirely into a field of glowing embers, Warren finally turned away. "Let's go. Sun'll be up soon." The brothers walked back into the night, their silhouettes swallowed by darkness, leaving behind only smoke, ash, and the unspoken truth that this was not the end at all, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. Dawn crept over the Texas plains with a muted stillness, the kind that follows destruction. A thin column of smoke still rose from the barn's remains, drifting upward like a signal no one wanted to acknowledge. By the time the sun fully broke over the horizon, the field had already begun to draw attention. Not from townsfolk, they knew better than to trespass on Redford land, but from wind, vultures, and the eerie silence left behind. The Redford brothers had barely gotten an hour of rest when the first knock hit their front door. Warren opened it to find Sheriff Amos Drayton standing on the porch, hat in hand, face drawn tight. He wasn't a friend of the Redfords, but he wasn't their enemy either. He was a man who understood lines, and the Redfords were a line no lawman crossed unless he absolutely had to. "Morning, Warren," Amos said, voice weary. "Sheriff, you hear anything last night? Folks claim they saw fire near the north field." Warren's expression didn't shift. "Dry season. Old barns go up easy." Amos studied him for a long moment, not confrontational, but searching. He knew the brothers too well. Behind Warren, the others sat silently at the table, Micah sharpening a blade, Boone pouring coffee, Elias staring at his own bruised reflection in a metal kettle, Caleb rolling tobacco, and Jareth motionless as stone. They didn't hide. They simply existed, unbothered by the sheriff's presence. "Thing is," Amos continued, "we found a whole lot more than burnt wood." Warren waited. 10 bodies, the sheriff said. "Or what's left of them." A brief pause settled over the room. It wasn't shock, just confirmation. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Now, I can't say yet who they were, but I'll tell you this. Somebody burned them alive, and whoever did it, they wanted the whole county to hear the message." Micah looked up from his sharpening. "You accusing us of something, Sheriff?" "I didn't say that," Amos replied carefully. "I'm saying the county's gonna start asking questions. And the Reyes Circle? They're not the type to stay quiet if someone hits them that hard." Boone scoffed. "What's left of them is quiet enough." Elias flinched at that. He remembered every face that had been inside that barn, remembered the jeers, the fists, the boot on his neck. They weren't men deserving mercy. But something Amos said lingered in the air like a warning. The county asking questions, and the surviving affiliates of the Reyes Circle hunting answers. Amos stepped off the porch. "I'll write it up as an accident for now, but Warren, whatever you boys are tangled in, pull yourselves loose. This land's got enough ghosts." He left without another word. Warren closed the door slowly. The brothers exchanged glances, no words needed. If Amos knew, even without proof, others would soon suspect the same. And while the Reyes Circle had lost 10 men, their remaining contacts, gamblers, gun runners, and vultures of every variety, wouldn't take the loss quietly. Elias broke the silence first. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said, eyes lowered. "When they dragged me behind the bar, I heard 2 of them talking. Said they were meeting with a buyer from Laredo, someone who wanted a cut of Redford land if the debt didn't get paid." Warren stiffened. "A buyer?" Elias nodded. They talked like it was already arranged, like the debt wasn't about money, but leverage. Micah cursed under his breath. "So this wasn't just a beatdown?" "No," Elias said. "They wanted us disarmed, off balance, and if I died it would have pushed the deal through." Boone slammed his fist on the table. Then burning them wasn't enough. Warren paced slowly, processing the threads. If outsiders were involved, men from Laredo, cartel-linked or worse, the barn fire would not end the feud. It would escalate it. "We'll need to find out who that buyer is," Warren said, "and what they plan to take from us." Jareth finally spoke, voice calm and cold. "Start with the remains." Elias frowned. "The remains?" Jareth nodded. "Men carry things in their pockets. Notes, matches, tokens. Someone in that barn had a clue." Caleb stood. "Then we go before Amos sends people back." Boone grabbed his coat. "Let's sift through what's left." Warren raised a hand. "Hold on." He looked each brother in the eye, grounding them the way their father once did. "We go together. No strays, no mistakes. Not today." They stepped outside, moving across the dry field. As they approached the charred ruins, the smell of burned flesh and soaked kerosene settled heavy around them. The structure was still warm, glowing faintly beneath layers of ash. Elias swallowed hard, but he didn't look away. Micah kicked aside a beam. Boone overturned blackened debris. Caleb sifted through pockets of soot, and then Jareth crouched near a half-melted belt buckle and brushed away ash with the flat of his hand. He found something. A metal ring, scorched but intact, with an emblem on the top. A coiled serpent around a pair of dice. Warren recognized it immediately. "That's not Reyes Circle," he said quietly. "That's Black Serpent Syndicate." Boone straightened. "They're from Laredo." Elias felt his stomach drop. The gang that beat him wasn't working alone. They were preparing the ground for something much bigger. Warren closed his fist around the ring, the burned metal still radiating heat. "Looks like we didn't just light up a barn," he said. "We lit a fuse." The discovery of the ring changed everything. The Redford brothers had assumed the barn fire had closed the chapter, a violent end to a violent night, but now they understood they had only torn the curtain, revealing a deeper threat that had been quietly threading its way toward their land long before Elias was ambushed. The Black Serpent Syndicate was not a street gang, nor a rowdy gambling crew. They were organized, territorial, and infamous for using intermediaries to soften up rural families before making a move. The brothers stood around the charred remains in a tight circle, the morning sun burning across the field, but none of them feeling its warmth. The ring's emblem, the serpent coiled around dice, glinted beneath the soot, sending a chill through the air that had nothing to do with the lingering smoke. Warren tucked the ring into his pocket. "We need answers," he said. "Real ones." Boone kicked aside another blackened beam. "Then we go to Laredo." Micah scoffed. "And walk into a nest?" "No. We handle this our way. Quiet, local. Someone around here knew they were coming." It was Elias who spoke, quietly but firmly. "There was a man watching me when they had me behind the bar. Didn't join in, didn't speak, just watched. Pale coat, gray hat. He wasn't one of the 10 we burned. Warren turned toward him sharply. You sure? Elias nodded. I remember his boots. Clean, polished. Didn't match the gang. That detail mattered. The Reyes circle were dirty fighters, bar drifters, debt collectors. But a clean pair of boots in a backroom beating? That suggested hierarchy. Someone observing. Someone cataloging how far the Redfords could be pushed before breaking. Then he's still out there, Caleb muttered. And he'll know by now, Jareth added, eyes fixed on the smoldering ruins. Word travels faster than fire. They returned to the house, each brother slipping into silent, controlled focus. The Redfords were never men of chaos. Everything they did came from calculation born of survival. Their land wasn't wealth. It was memory. Their father's sweat. Their mother's grave on the South Ridge. Every inch mattered. Inside, Warren spread a map of the county on the dining table. The Serpent Syndicate uses shadow routes, he said. Dry creek beds, old trapper roads, places sheriff's deputies ignore. If someone from Laredo came here, he'd take one of these. Boone leaned over and tapped a finger near the western border. Bent Creek Road. Micah nodded. Makes sense. Leads right to Red Hollow. Cuts toward the old distillery. Elias's breath caught. The distillery. That's where they dragged me before driving me to the bar. I smelled smoke. Not cigarette smoke, wood smoke. Someone was camped there. That locked it. A staging ground. Someone had been watching the Redfords long before the night of the debt. We start at the distillery, Warren decided. They armed themselves, not with rifles or flashy weapons, but with the tools they trusted. Micah's hunting knife, Boone's double barrel, Caleb's makeshift axe, Elias's .38, and Jareth's old lever-action Winchester. Warren carried the ring, the newest symbol of a war none of them had agreed to but had no choice but to enter. As they headed out, dust rising behind them, Warren kept replaying the sheriff's words. The county asking questions, the Reyes circle preparing retaliation, and now the syndicate lurking behind the scenes. Their enemies weren't just gamblers. They were connected men willing to bleed territory dry until it belonged to them. The drive to the distillery cut through dry brush, mesquite trees bending under the heat. When they approached the old building, abandoned since Prohibition, the brothers slowed. The air smelled faintly of charred oak, and tracks in the dirt hinted at recent visitors. Boone cocked his gun. Someone's been here. Micah crouched, running his fingers across a footprint. Two someones, one heavy, one light. Not long ago. Warren signaled silently. They moved as a unit, spreading yet staying close enough to cover each other. The distillery's interior was dim, filled with dust and scattered barrels. Light filtered through holes in the roof, casting broken beams across the floor. It was Elias who noticed the first sign, a cigarette butt crushed near a makeshift bedroll. He picked it up carefully. Imported, he said. Mexican brand. Micah's jaw tightened. Syndicate. Then Caleb called out softly, Warren, Yas, look at this. Pinned to a pillar with a hunting knife was a folded note. Warren pulled it free. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. We know what you did. We're coming to collect what's owed. And we don't burn as easy as your tenants. Boone's face darkened. Tenants? They weren't tenants. They were pawns, Jareth said quietly. Disposable. Warren's eyes scanned the final line. 2 nights. That was the timeline. 2 nights before the syndicate returned. Not for justice, not for revenge, but for land, leverage, and the satisfaction of crushing a family that dared resist. The Redfords hadn't just lit a fuse. They were standing at the mouth of a wildfire. Warren folded the note carefully, slid it into his pocket beside the ring, and turned to his brothers. We're not waiting 2 nights, he said. We find them first. And when we do? Micah asked. Warren's voice didn't rise, it didn't tremble, it didn't crack. They burned our blood into the ground. We returned the message. The brothers nodded. The hunt had begun, and the syndicate had no idea how violently the Redfords intended to answer. The Redford brothers split across the clearing outside the distillery, each one scanning the tree line with the controlled precision of men who had lived half their lives expecting ambushes. Warren held the note in one hand, the syndicate ring in the other, watching how the two pieces fit together like parts of a story that had been written long before they ever struck a match on that barn. "They're not hiding," Boone muttered, glancing around. "They're circling, watching how we move." "Good," Warren replied. "Then let them watch." He wasn't being reckless. He was setting bait. The syndicate men would expect panic or disarray, but the Redfords didn't panic. Not after fire, not after blood, not after the threat of a countdown. If the syndicate wanted to observe how the brothers reacted under pressure, the Redfords would give them a performance worth memorizing. Micah kicked the dirt near the tire tracks leading away from the distillery. "These head south," he said, "toward the riverbed." Jareth narrowed his eyes. "South? Why go south unless they're meeting someone," Warren finished. The Black Serpent Syndicate didn't operate in small groups. Spotters, runners, scouts, and informants all worked in tandem. If two men had camped here, they weren't alone in the county. Others were scattered, blending with workers, hitchhikers, or drifters along the Texas-Mexico corridor. "Then we start flushing them out," Warren said. They drove along Bent Creek Road until the land opened into vast stretches of scrub and dust. As they approached the Rio Navarro riverbed, the brothers spotted something that made Warren raise a fist for everyone to stop. A lone pickup truck, engine cold, parked beneath a cottonwood tree. Boone stepped forward, shotgun low and steady. "Looks empty." "Nothing's empty," Micah said under his breath. They spread out, circling the vehicle. Jareth checked the bed, empty burlap bags, a metal drum, and a half-open crate. Inside the cab, Elias found a map with 3 red X's drawn across the county. But the detail that made Warren's stomach twist was the 4th X, directly over their land. "They marked us," Elias muttered, voice low. "Days ago." Warren traced the dates scribbled beside each mark. "These aren't targets," he said. "They're progress. The syndicate is mapping influence. First the border trails, then the distillery, then the Reyes Circle territory, and next, Redford land," Jareth finished. Boone's eyes hardened. "Not happening." Micah leaned into the truck searching for anything else, and then froze. Beneath the seat was a small metal tin. Inside, burnt matchsticks and a shred of cloth stained with kerosene. "Arson kit," Micah muttered. This wasn't reconnaissance. They were planning to torch something else. Elias swallowed hard. "What?" "The barn's already gone." Warren knew. The brothers felt it before he even spoke. "They're going after the house." The drive back was silent except for the engine rattling across uneven terrain. When they crested the hill overlooking their homestead, the sight made Caleb slam his fist against the dashboard. A thin thread of smoke rose from behind the tool shed, not a fire, but the remnants of one. Warren stopped the truck so abruptly that dust exploded around them. The brothers sprinted across the yard, weapons drawn, senses sharp. Micah reached the shed first and scanned the ground. A small pile of ashes smoldered beside the wall. Papers, burned deliberately. "Someone was here," he muttered. "Minutes ago." Elias examined the charred scraps. "Ledger pages," he said. "Dad's old records." That struck deeper than any threat. Their father's handwriting reduced to gray streaks in the dirt wasn't just vandalism. It was a message, a violation of history, an attempt to erase the legacy that held the Redford clan together. Boone's jaw tightened. If they touched those, they were inside the house. The brothers moved in formation toward the front porch. Warren checked the door, unlocked. Either someone forgot to secure it, or someone had forced it open and then pretended nothing happened. Inside, nothing looked broken, nothing looked stolen, but the air felt wrong. Chairs slightly shifted, curtains drawn not quite as they had left them. Caleb ran his hand across the banister and held it up. Dust moved. Someone was on the stairs. They searched each room. Bedrooms untouched, kitchen still warm from the morning coffee. But the hallway table, where their mother's old copper locket sat, was empty. Elias's voice cracked. "It's gone." Warren closed his eyes for a brief moment. The syndicate wasn't just gathering information. They were personalizing the conflict, leaving fingerprints on the brothers' past, future, and identity. Fire was one message. Theft was another. Micah pointed to the windowsill. "Boot prints," he said. "Same pattern as the distillery camp." One of the syndicate watchers had been inside their home, while they were out hunting him. "They're pushing us," Jareth muttered. "No," Warren said. "They're testing how far they can go without dying." He went to the table, took the ring from his pocket, and set it down with slow deliberation. The metal gleamed under the afternoon light like a challenge. Boone exhaled sharply. "What's the plan?" Warren didn't hesitate. "We stop responding." The brothers looked at him. "We stop reacting to their moves. We stop chasing their shadows. We make them come to us. And when they do, we end this on our terms." "That's risky," Micah said. "It's necessary." Warren pointed to the ring, then to the burnt ledger scraps, then to the footprint near the window. "They think we're playing defense. We're not. Tonight, we shift this fight." Elias looked up slowly. "How?" Warren's voice fell into a tone they had only heard twice before, the tone he used when survival meant becoming something sharper, fiercer, and far less forgiving. "We turn our land into a trap." The brothers spent the next hours in silence, moving with precision, preparing the property for the storm they knew was coming. They blocked side roads with felled logs. They dug shallow trenches near the western edge. They placed lanterns in specific windows to create misleading silhouettes. They set metal wires across the lower brush, where syndicate scouts would least expect them. The Redfords weren't waiting to be attacked. They were preparing an execution ground, and as dusk settled across the Texas horizon, a sound echoed from the far road. Distant engines, multiple, creeping toward the homestead with slow, deliberate certainty. Warren stepped onto the porch, Winchester in hand, eyes narrowed. "It begins," he said. And the brothers took their positions. The flames had long died on Red Rock Wash, but the smell lingered like a stain burned into the land itself. By the next morning, the sky over West Arroyo carried a sepia haze, half dust, half smoke, rolling low between the buttes as if the desert were holding its breath. The Redford brothers were back at the ranch before dawn, their bodies aching, their hands blistered, their clothes stiff with soot. But no one spoke of rest, because they all knew the same truth. The 10 men they burned were only the surface of the debt. Underneath it, something else waited. Around 6 in the morning, the brothers gathered in the barn, a place usually reserved for tools, horses, and silence. But today it carried the weight of a war room. Thomas paced like a caged bull, the cuts on his knuckles reopening with every flex. Clyde leaned against a support beam, rubbing ash from his beard, eyes narrowed as if replaying each scream in his mind. Dean sat on a crate near the lantern, his expression rigid, unreadable. Earl stood in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, scanning the yard as if expecting headlights to come roaring up the path. No one mentioned the previous night. No one needed to. The memory crackled between them like embers refusing to die. But there was a deeper problem. The 10 dead men might have belonged to the Reno Street Syndicate, but debts rarely ended where bodies did. Word was already traveling, and they knew it. Men like that had handlers, bankrolls, shot callers, the kind of criminals who didn't take losses lightly. And the Redfords had just turned a $12,000 insult into a declaration of war. Thomas finally stopped pacing. "They're coming," he said. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, but they'll come." Clyde spit into the dirt. "Let 'em. They ain't walking into Texas without paying their toll in blood." But Dean shook his head slowly. "You think they'll come riding up with guns out like fools? No. They'll come soft, quiet. They'll watch us, study us, then they'll pick us off." Thomas looked at him. "So what do you suggest?" Dean exhaled through his nose, Slow, controlled. We strike first. Find who's in charge of the gamblers. Cut the head off before the body wakes up. Silence. It wasn't the violence that unsettled the room. Violence was their language. What unsettled them was the precision in Dean's tone, the cold calculation that meant he'd already accepted how far this would go. Earl stepped fully inside the barn now, closing the door behind him. "I overheard something last night," he said, "when those bastards were screaming. One of them mentioned a name, Lowell Crane, said he was going to kill us himself." Thomas frowned. "Crane? From Fort Mason?" "Yeah," Earl nodded. "That one." A quiet, collective shift moved through the room, a recognition of genuine danger. Lowell Crane wasn't a street thug. He was a coordinator, someone who moved money, weapons, men, someone who never got his own hands dirty because he hired people who enjoyed the work. Clyde's jaw tightened. "If he's coming, we ain't waiting for him." Thomas agreed. "We go after him. Tonight." But as soon as he spoke, Dean raised a hand. "Not tonight. Not with half the county still smelling smoke from what we did. We move now. The sheriff will follow the tracks right back to this ranch. We wait for the dust to settle. We plan. Then we take Crane." Earl shifted uneasily. Plan what? That was the question the desert itself seemed to echo. Because the Redford brothers weren't strategists. They were reactionaries, forged by years of survival and stitched together by rage. Planning required patience, precision, restraint. But for the first time since childhood, their backs were against a wall. Thomas looked around the barn, rows of tools, coils of rope, rusted branding irons, and his mind began assembling something dark. "We know the land better than Crane ever will," he said. "We have the ravines, the canyons, the wash, and he'll travel with maybe 6 or 7 men. Won't risk more." Clyde smirked. 6 or 7 ain't near enough." "It is," Dean corrected, "if they catch us divided." The barn grew still again, the brothers forming a tight circle without meaning to. Thomas continued, lowering his voice. "We track Crane's movement. He'll send scouts first. We let them find what we want them to find." "And what's that?" Earl asked. Dean answered before Thomas could. "A weakness. One we choose, not one he discovers." Clyde nodded slowly. "A trap." "A trap," Thomas repeated. "Built our way. On our land." The plan became a living thing right there. Primitive, brutal, and perfectly suited to a clan that believed in settling debts with fire and fear. But as they shaped it, something else crept silently into the room. Doubt. Not fear of the fight, fear of the outcome. Because hunting 10 gamblers was vengeance. Hunting their commander was annihilation. And deep down, each brother understood that striking at Crane meant there was no going back. No quiet ranch life, no fading into the desert. This would chase them for years, maybe forever. Clyde cracked his knuckles. "Then we finish the job," he said. "No half measures, not this time." Thomas nodded. "We start tonight. Earl, check the back roads. Clyde, you get the rifles ready, Dean." But Dean cut in. "I'll find Crane's location." "How?" Earl asked. Dean's eyes narrowed with the cold clarity only desperate men possess. "Because men like Crane always leave footprints, money trails, informants, frightened locals. Someone knows where he sleeps. And by dusk, so will I." The other brothers exchanged a look. Half pride, half concern. Dean had always been the quiet one, but quiet men saw things others missed. As they broke the circle and moved to their tasks, the barn door creaked open, letting in the morning glare. The light cut across their faces like a blade, 4 silhouettes stepping from the darkness into something far more dangerous than vengeance. They had burned 10 men alive. Now they were preparing to burn the world that sent them. And in the empty, dusty silence that followed them out of the barn, the desert seemed to whisper the one truth none of them dared say aloud. There were still debts left to collect. By sundown, the Redford ranch had transformed from a family property into a fortress made of instinct, fear, and iron resolve. The sky glowed a deep, blood-warm orange as the final light slipped behind the canyons, carving long shadows across the fields like dark fingers reaching for the house. Coyotes howled in the distance, but even their cries seemed cautious, as if nature itself sensed that the land was bracing for something violent. Thomas stood at the fence line, staring toward the horizon where the dust trails of distant roads vanished into nothing. His shoulders carried the exhaustion of the last 48 hours, but his eyes held the same cold determination that ignited the creek the night they burned the gamblers. He had crossed a line, and he knew there was no returning to the man he had been before the debt. Inside the barn, Clyde polished the rifles with hands that shook only slightly. Rage steadied him. Fear made him precise. Every click of metal on metal echoed through the quiet air. Earl sat on an overturned bucket nearby, tying strips of cloth around jars of kerosene, primitive, ugly weapons that matched the clan's temperament. Dean, however, was the one they all watched from the corner of their eyes. He moved differently now, slower, calculating, his jaw tight with a knowledge he hadn't yet shared. Because Dean had found Crane. Right before dusk, he'd returned with dust on his boots and something darker in his expression. He waited until they were all assembled in the barn to speak, and when he finally did, the air tightened around them. "Crane's not in Fort Mason anymore," Dean said. "He's already here, in our county." Silence. Clyde gripped the handle of a shotgun. "How close?" Dean didn't blink. 15 miles, maybe less." Earl swore under his breath. Thomas's jaw hardened. "How many men?" Thomas asked. 6 with him," Dean replied. "Experienced, armed. They're moving slow, asking questions in backwater bars. They know we burned the gamblers. They know why. And Crane..." Dean's voice lowered. "Crane ain't here for a conversation. He brought enough guns to bleed us dry." Thomas lifted his chin with grim acceptance. "So the fight has already started." Dean nodded. Clyde cracked his neck. "Then let's ride out and put him in the dirt before they get any closer." But Dean raised his hand. "No, they expect us to come charging. They're waiting for it." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "You have another idea?" Dean stepped toward the center of the barn, lantern light casting sharp lines across his face. "We lure them to Red Rock Wash," he said. "It's narrow, predictable, and we control every inch of it. They'll have one path in, one path out, and we end it there." Clyde's eyes brightened with something fierce. "Like the gamblers?" Dean shook his head. "No flames this time, not at first. Crane's smarter than them. If we use fire too early, he'll scatter his men into the hills." Thomas folded his arms. "So what do we use?" "Fear," Dean said. "The same thing they tried to bring to us." For the first time in hours, Thomas felt something like pride. Dean wasn't just reacting anymore. He was leading. And the others felt it too. They spent the next hour preparing the canyon. Earl rode out to place lanterns and decoys along the ridge to create false silhouettes. Clyde set traps, tripwires, buried snares, anything to slow Crane's advance. Thomas walked the wash itself, memorizing every curve of the land like a general studying a battlefield. Night fully claimed the sky by the time they regrouped. The moon hung thin and sharp, painting silver streaks across the dry stone. The air was cold enough to sting their lungs. Then they waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. And then they heard it. Engines. Slow, cautious, crawling along the dirt road. Thomas signaled the brothers into position. Clyde crouched behind a boulder with the shotgun. Earl gripped the kerosene jars, sweat forming on his palms despite the cold. Dean lay prone on a ledge, rifle steady, breath controlled. 6 headlights appeared at the canyon mouth, glowing like eyes in the darkness. Crane's convoy. The vehicles rolled to a stop. Doors opened. Shadows climbed out. Tall, armed, disciplined. The brothers watched in silence as Crane himself stepped forward. Lean, sharp-featured, unfazed by the night or the land. "Redfords," Crane called, his voice echoing down the wash. "I know you're here." Thomas stepped out first, his silhouette framed by moonlight. "You got a lot of nerve coming onto our land," he said, voice steady. Crane smirked. You burned 10 of my men alive. I'd say that justifies a personal visit. Thomas didn't flinch. They earned what they got. Crane's men shifted, guns glinted, tension tightened the entire canyon. Then Crane spoke again, quieter, colder. You think fire scares me? You think fear works on a man who's buried more bodies than you've shaken hands? Dean clicked the safety off his rifle, the sound crisp and lethal. Thomas stared at Crane. You ain't leaving this canyon. Crane smiled like he'd been waiting for those words. Then everything exploded at once. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the stone walls in violent ricochets. Clyde opened from the flank, taking down one of Crane's men instantly. Earl hurled the first kerosene jar, shattering near the rear truck and engulfing it in flame. The canyon illuminated in violent orange, shadows leaping like devils. Crane dove behind a boulder, firing with cold precision. His men spread out, but the narrow terrain worked against them. Every movement exposed them to a Redford waiting in the dark. Dean's rifle cracked twice. 2 more syndicate men dropped. Thomas moved through the chaos like a storm, his revolver barking fire. The brothers fought in practiced rhythm. 4 bodies, 1 intent. Within minutes, Crane's men were reduced to screams, curses, and desperate shots fired blind into the canyon walls. But Crane himself refused to fall. He broke from cover, sprinting across the wash with calculated fury. Clyde lunged to intercept him but caught a bullet in the shoulder and fell to one knee. Earl charged next, swinging a burning board from the debris. Crane sidestepped, slashing Earl across the ribs with a hidden knife before pushing past him. Dean fired, but Crane disappeared behind a rock, forcing Dean to reposition. Thomas advanced alone now, stepping into the open. The 2 men faced each other in the smoking ruin of the canyon. Crane spat blood, lifting his gun. You should have stayed out of my business. Thomas raised his own. You came into our county, into our land. Then, 2 shots, echoing, final. Crane fell first. Thomas didn't fall at all. When the smoke cleared, the canyon was silent except for the crackle of dying flames. Dean rushed down the ledge. Clyde stood clutching his bleeding shoulder. Earl leaned against a rock, breathing hard but alive. Thomas looked at the bodies scattered across the wash. Crane and his men sprawled like broken shadows. The debt was settled. But as the brothers stared across the destruction, none of them felt victory, only inevitability. Clyde finally broke the silence. What now? Thomas holstered his gun. Now we disappear, because they'll never let it go. Dean nodded. We head south, tonight. Earl managed a small, grim laugh. Reckon Texas won't miss us. Thomas looked back one last time at Red Rock Wash, the place where one debt had ended and a lifetime of consequences had begun. No, he said quietly, but they'll remember us. The brothers walked into the darkness, leaving behind a canyon of ashes, and Texas for decades would whisper about the night the Redford clan settled their final debt in blood and fire.